poursuivre ma communication en anglais, c'est plus facile pour moi. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and I am very pleased to join you in this conference, which I have followed mostly yesterday till very late, and this morning partly. I apologize that I couldn't be there, but I have enjoyed all the talks I have listened to. I've been doing Islamic theology and philosophy and theology for the last couple of years, and they have worked on the idea of European Islam, and I've also worked on some figures from the French context. Some of them are present in this platform. Actually, my communication today will be based from my background, which is theoretical. So I will leave the juridical aspect, which has been emphasized or dealt with from yesterday and some panels this morning that I followed. And this requires giving some framework within which I think over Islam in 21st century and currently and in the future. The first thing that I would like to start with is that we need to distinguish between the majority and minority contexts of Muslims and where they are. They are, because the historical difference between the two is that important, and the interpretations within the context and the way the Muslim communities, intellectuals, theologians, philosophers, and civil society activists interact and within these contexts differ. The liberal secular context of Europe, or Western Europe in particular, and the United States or North America at large, is different from the way things are in the so-called Arab world or the broad Middle East and the rest of the so-called Islamic world. The second point is that the concept of the Islamic world is obsolete, I think, and it should be overcome. If it has served some political agenda for some good time for the last 2 centuries, from the colonial experience or enterprise until now, I think it is high time this is overcome. First, because the Islamic world is so diverse, so plural, even within one country context or society context, it is very plural, let alone a broad or vast geography as that of so-called Islamdom or the Islamic world. Maybe the Muslim world instead of Islamic world might be more relevant, but even that has to be revisited. The Islamic world was governed by Sharia worldview until the 18th century, 19th century, when it came into contact with so-called modern West, within which Muslim majority society have born and experienced important changes since then, and they are still doing. So they are no longer Islamic or governed fully by Sharia worldview in all fields, from private matters to business to international law. They are no longer working under that platform or for that framework. And then if I said Muslim world because it is the individual that is emphasized in modern times, and Muslims are taking initiatives, and within the nation state, each nation state has developed its own mechanisms and leading or dealing with changes. But still, at least Muslim world might function for some time. Then the other alternative might be post-Islamist societies, because Islam rules very minor, at least classical Islamic law or Sharia law rules or dominates only a part of family law and inheritance and divorce, etc. Apart from that, the states have managed to find ways of having a leeway in incorporating international law and including human rights in a long, an important space of the so-called Muslim world. And that post-Islamist society is not my concept. It was already used by sociologists, the Iranian sociologist Azib Bayat in 1969 article, famous article or in the French context, it was not used as such, but the idea behind it was there from the work of 1990, 92 of Olivier Roy, when he spoke of the failure of political Islam. And by between brackets, the failure of political Islam did not mean the end of political Islam. That's the meaning that was used by Olivier Roy, and so many other scholars quote him without understanding what he meant. What he meant is that political Islam didn't have projects anymore. A project that is different from so-called modern European-dominated project of change. That is what he meant by the failure of political Islam, which doesn't mean that it would disappear in short period of time. And we have seen that from the 1990s until 2022, today, I mean, it has appeared and disappeared in different, and has worn different hats and in different countries until from the Arab Spring, and then after the Arab Spring or autumn, or call it as you may. So now I return to the point of what I want to focus on. If we leave aside the political weight we are obsessed with and the juridical aspect of it, because of the rumor political Islam makes, I think there is another element that should concern us if we want to think of Islam in 21st century, as the title of the conference is about, and the diversities within the way it could be conceived, or is already conceived and lived, and might be further lived. And that's a philosophy of religion here helps. And the way I work with it is just to rethink again what could Quranic worldview or Sharia worldview in its broad sense, not legal aspect, could mean. Well, we think we need three axes here. We need to think of how religions or faith traditions first, how faith traditions work. They present a worldview, a cosmology, and that's what remains in the traditions. And the rest is ephemeral and changes. That's why faith traditions say they are atemporal, ahistorical. And then the second axis is social axis or society axis. And that's what particular faiths, they develop themselves into apparatuses, into religious establishments, into hierarchies. Some of them become independent, some of them cohabitate with either empires, and they function well within empires. That's where the faith traditions that still live today, the world ones, including Islam or Christianity, etc., they flourished and worked and developed their legal corpus in imperial times. And that impacts the way they move ahead in society. And societies or traditions that have strong traditions, apparatuses, they find fatigue in changing when the moment of change comes. It's better to start from zero than to change something that is already there. And then it's the individual aspect. And that's also central in faith tradition. They start with the individual, but they don't stop at the individual. These three axes have to be considered according to at least three other levels of analysis. And that's time and space and the mind space, the mindscape, or the intellectual apparatus that looks at this faith tradition in particular time and particular context, and from a particular angle. Is it historical? Is it sociological, anthropological? Is it philosophic, theologic? Is it esoteric, mystic? And that leads me to say that a faith tradition like Islam is not easy to define. Because we can think of, if we take what I've said now into account and we try to outline it further, we'll come up with at least 5 to 6 big labels or parameters within which we can put our eggs, if you want. So we can interpret the faith tradition of Islam and its moral worldview according to these frameworks, and we can reach the following, at least broad labels. We have popular Islam, and each geographical area has its version of interpreting Islam. I don't think, here anthropologists and sociologists can easily say, well, that's true. An anthropologist or a sociologist working in Morocco and then in Indonesia, and there are famous Anglo-Saxon scholars who worked on that, they find similarities, but they find sometimes absolutely, too big differences of how Islam is lived between these geographies. Then you can think of political Islam and its variety, from the broad conservative but non-violent to the ultra, and which are mainstream is conservative but not violent. But then you have the ultra orthodox or Salafi, which is extreme in its rigidity, but still doesn't mean it's violent, but it could lead, as some say or interpret. And then you have the radical, which finds resources in some of these. Then you can think of state Islam. State Islam is different from political Islam. They do compete. State Islam is dominated, monopolized by the modern states in Muslim majority societies. Moroccan Islam is different from Algerian Islam. They are neighbors, but the way they work is different. They do compete. They share many things, but they also are different. They're different from Saudi Islam, from Iranian Islam, from Turkish Islam. Then you have theological, philosophical Islam. That's intellectual Islam. And there are different views there, different schools, either in the past or in the present. They build on the past, they move on, they are exchange with modern philosophical, theological views. And then you have, here you can include also Sufi Islam as an intellectual. Otherwise, you can put it as an independent, different category of Islam among these. Then there is another Islam, which is not the one that is whose agents are Muslims themselves, as these five, but it's non-Muslims. The non-Muslims that study Islam are also stakeholders in what Islam means and what Islam should mean. And here I refer to the tradition of Orientalism. Well, of course, here we can distinguish between the biased. I here mean mostly the biased Oriental tradition. Of course, there is objective and neutral scientific Orientalism from which all scholars have learned, but there is a biased tradition that was nurtured by classical imaginary rivalry, realistic also rivalry between Islamdom and Christendom, and that was there in the 18th century, and some of that tradition lives until now in some Islamophobic narratives and right-wing narratives. So these also have their views of what Islam and Muslims mean. And sometimes they have their views of what Islam and Muslims should mean and how they should act. All these then are stakeholders. That makes defining what is Islam, what is Islamic, a complicated process. But at the end, we can escape to say that, well, Islam and Muslims are plural. There are as many Islams as the number of Muslims. So you can count and say, and find out how many there are. Well, this again does not mean that there is something that is the source. And it's that source that is negotiated and negotiable. And that's why I think in moral philosophy and philosophy of religion, the distinction between faith and religion is absolutely necessary. Because as I said before, religion is the whole apparatus that develops in particular language, in particular context, over time, over centuries. And it involves politics and non-politics, etc. But faith tradition is that moral compass that remains. It is that guideline that everyone among all these would agree on in principle. And that's what the Quran, I think, and many others do think, that is all about. It's first of all a moral compass. It's a guideline. But the point is that I want to draw attention to here. A lot of scholars, well, most scholars use morality and ethics interchangeably. But I think there is a distinction that should be underlined. And I've been thinking of it for a while, and I'm trying to develop it. And that distinction is referred in some other literature, in other traditions, but in the Islamic tradition, note that fully. Though it is there, the potential for it and different concepts of it are there. While morality, while faith tradition it can be considered, first of all, a moral source or source of morality for its adherents or believers. But at the end, if a moral tradition is very personal and stays at home or very private, as might simplistically be understood, then as a theologians or philosopher, you wonder, what's the use behind it if it remains very personal? That's an egoistic tradition if it remains very personal, right? That's why I think it goes out to the public. Of course, when it finds resources and interpretations, it goes to the political. But here we need to distinguish between the public and the political. What I mean by the ethical is that passage from the moral, from the personal, from the very private to the public. We cannot assume that a believer in any tradition, and here we are focusing on Islam, but this applies to any other. We cannot assume that a believer who believes at home, when he goes out, he leaves his tradition at home, and that he does not when he is in the street, in the supermarket, at school, in leisure time, does not think of God. At least that's the impression or the interpretation we have in Abrahamic traditions and Islam in particular, when the idea of God is omnipresent. And you have to have that moral compass always with you, not to control you just because you are ready to sin, no, but because human beings need to control themselves, and they would need to feel that they are doing certain things that appear not in contradiction with their innate nature. And if they do some act, they feel themselves embarrassed. That's what morality is about. But that morality, again, needs space outside, in the public. And it is when the Homo Moralis, in my abstract I sent and the article, draft I sent, I've used the term Homo Moralis and Homo Ethicus. I think in the contemporary context we are in, there is a lot of fear of religion in the public sphere. And the idea that I'm saying that religion cannot stay at home might be problematic for many reformists. But when I was in India and I bought the autobiography of Gandhi, at the end of his, it's entitled My Experiment with Truth. That's the autobiography of Gandhi. And he says, it's a beautiful final paragraph. He says, those who think that religion is a private matter do not know what religion is about. And I think he's very right. And I give another note and explain myself better. And please give me a note about time when it's 2 minutes left. I didn't take my time this time. Sorry for that. So the point I'm saying this, that while there is a need, a dire need for radical, important changes in Islamic law for Muslim majority societies and minority societies, I think the Muslim community or Muslims in general, they should not shy away from speaking in the public about their moral sources. That does not mean you are bringing religion into the political. No, I'm saying you can bring it in the public debate. And that's the difference, and we can discuss there the limits. Because there is a social contract that bounds everyone, every believer, and every believer can come to the public sphere with his moral attitude. Because if you ask citizens to all become Republican in one version, that's authoritarian. That's not democratic. If you are asking people in liberal secular societies, let alone in authoritarian and democratic ones, if you are asking them to come and talk the same language, then that's not democratic anymore. That's not liberal at all. As long as there is, the discourse is not violent and it meets the basic constitutional demands of particular land. I think I hear the microphone. It's 2 minutes?
Yeah, less than 2 minutes.
Less than 2 minutes.
Thank
so
you.
I'm concluding. Yeah, I'm concluding. So that's the point. The point is this moral attitude. Let's assume that Muslims reform in mainstream societies, and we ask them that at the end you have to reform, but there's Protestant ethic as an example. They say, well, that requires of them to have civic engagement. How can we teach this civic engagement? We say, well, there are universal norms and human rights. Of course, they are. And Islamic tradition does agree, I think, with those norms. But we can only say that Muslims can contribute to that debate if we assume that their moral view teaches them those values. If we say that the Islamic tradition does not teach those values, then we are, by implication, say that actually they cannot participate in the public sphere, they cannot contribute to the world discussions on environment, on bioethics, on any civic and civilizational project for shared humanity. So that's my take. And I could not give more examples from liberal expressions of how some progressive views are dealing with that. But there are projects that have been expressed, and they will be expressed in the platform here. And they are examples of this diversity within the tradition. But again, there is one note I conclude with. It is this distinction, which I will not explore, maybe in discussion, over spirituality and spiritualism. I am afraid that some of the discourse on spirituality and spiritualism might be shallow if it is not filled with real, practical morality. And that's what I refer to as ethics. Thank you very much.